Hi guys, right, today I'm looking at Valerian, directed by Luc Besson, starring Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne. Now this film was on my radar a lot to do because of the director, because he directed Fifth Element. He's directed other films, Taken, some of the Transporter films, also Leon as well, another very good film. But certainly Fifth Element from the sci-fi perspective has been one of my favourite films over the years. It's a film that just sort of stands alone by itself. It doesn't have any sort of big storyline or sort of various prequels or sequels or anything like that to it. It's just one film by itself, and the more I watch that film, the more I sort of enjoy it. And that might be the case with this film, but unfortunately, certainly in terms of the first watching of it, there's so many weird things wrong with it. Almost the entire film is just sort of a mismatch of all sorts of weird random scenes that don't really, they sort of tie in a little bit, but not really. It's almost like watching Around the World in 80 Days, but in sci-fi, just lots of sort of random scenes just to sort of tick boxes to sort of be in certain places, and it sort of felt a little bit like that. I don't know what went wrong with this film when it got edited, but that seems to be the bit where it probably fell down. But getting more into it, the initial concept of the film I really liked. Just to warn you, there are spoilers in this review. The International Space Station basically sort of evolves and keeps getting bigger, so you've got new countries and different races and stuff joining it. So we start to see sort of various different countries and nationalities joining up with the International Space Station. They're getting bigger and bigger and having more and more people on it. And then eventually an alien race came and introduced itself, and then we start to see more alien races, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Accumulation of all these different sort of ships and races from all sorts of different parts of the universe all coming together and sort of joining as part of this kind of, they called it Alpha, almost like a sort of trade hub, but almost it's kind of becoming almost like a planet itself. And it becomes so heavy that its mass is actually going to make it crash into Earth. So they decide to basically set it off on its way and leave the Earth's orbit and go off out into space and see what happens, in essence. And that's what happens. And as they go out there, they build up, it becomes more and more. And then a few thousand years later, we are then into the sort of the actual main crux of the film. And this particular place, Alpha, is now absolutely massive and consists of all sorts of different species with all sorts of different specializations, having to live in various different environments where they couldn't really interact. So, some have to live in liquid environments, some has to be super hot. It's cool, and the different looks of the different races and stuff that we sort of see bits of really looks cool, and certainly did remind me of Fifth Element, of that whole sort of new way of doing things, not being influenced by a lot of the other sort of franchises that are already about, making their own stuff, albeit some of the stuff did look like things we've seen before, certainly things that we'd seen from Fifth Element a little bit before. I have no problems with that. All of that was really good. We then get introduced to this other planet with a sort of race that's a complete rip-off of Avatar. Well, not a complete rip-off, but very similar. And in essence, basically, their planet gets destroyed. And that is the early part of the film, and what we're sort of working around and what it's going to be about is this race sort of losing their planet and a few of them surviving. We then meet our two main characters, which is General Valerian and Sergeant Laureen. And unfortunately, this is the main problem with the film. These two. I didn't buy into this at all. There was no sort of backstory, anything about really what they were sort of doing, and they sort of acting like they'd first met but not first met, and they're both on this ship together, sunbathing. That's all nonsense. But throughout the film, I did not buy into either of these two. I didn't think is the greatest of actresses, to be honest. I haven't really seen much of her before. I have seen him in a few things, and I hadn't really minded him so much in other stuff. But in this, I found him quite annoying. And he's doing that action hero thing that a lot of people do to kind of come across as a hero, which is just going like this. I'm the hero and I talk like this, and if I keep talking like this, then it makes me sound masterful. No, it doesn't. It just looked like a little boy trying to pretend to be a man, even though he's older than I actually thought he was. In the case with both of them, I don't really quite understand how they got where they got to. I don't need a massive backstory, but it really didn't make sense. He seemed to be quite a high-ranking military official to an extent. How? But anyway, that by the by, there's also a love interest between the two of them where he's basically trying to hit on her, and he pretty much proposes to her near the start of the film, and that kind of runs throughout the film. And that storyline as well, unfortunately, just didn't hit home at all. Didn't work. For me, it was actually quite painful. I wish they'd stopped talking about it and pretending to fancy each other. It just didn't work for me, that. Leading up all towards more or less almost the end scene, which was just a painful conversation between the two of them. Didn't work. All that said, throughout the film, I mean, it's hard to really explain what happens, to be honest. But in short, this alien race that had their planet destroyed are remarkably intelligent in the way they learn things. They learn things very, very quickly and seem to learn all sorts of stuff while they're surviving on this sort of basically little spaceship that gets knocked out into space when their planet gets blown up. And they learn all sorts of things. They go and land on Alpha. They end up kidnapping the sort of the head of the human organisation for it. Which again, there's just so many holes. When that happened, there was like no security around except for our two characters really. And then they went chasing off after them. And this is where the film sort of fell apart actually. We've met our characters and they're basically having to be sort of bodyguards for the head of the sort of human element of Alpha, who are also more or less in charge to an extent of Alpha from what I understood. And then this congregation where they're all gathering to have a conversation about various stuff and the threats to Alpha and all of this gets attacked, and it's by this alien race that's had their planet destroyed, and they come in and they kidnap him, and then Valerian starts chasing off after them to try and stop them. There seems to be no other security throughout this entire complex, this whole Alpha place, all of these to do anything about this whatsoever, except for Valerian chasing off. And once he goes off and then disappears into some sort of Badlands or something like that, that's where the film really becomes incredibly disjointed. Bizarrely disjointed. There are scenes which I was sort of saying to him, why are we here? What are we doing here? There's a point where I don't understand, but we end up having an excuse to go in a submarine to then have some sort of big, almost like Godzilla monsters chasing after Sergeant Laurie, who's trying to get this sort of jellyfish thing so then she can go and stick her head up its arse to find out what Valerian was thinking just before he went missing or something, to then try and figure out where he was. She knew pretty much where he was by watching this radar before he went off the radar. That would have been probably a more successful way of finding him than, well, I don't know. She did find him, and then that led to something that was sort of weird and disjointed. I don't quite understand. She ends up being captured by this sort of race that in essence wants to eat her brain, although she doesn't know that, and that leads to this weird wedding scene with her in a wedding dress kind of, and then nonsense, but they just go and kill a whole load of people sort of slightly unnecessarily in my opinion. And prior to that bit, while she's kidnapped, Valerian's ends up going to a bar, club, strip joint kind of place, I think, to solve this, and he meets this character who's played by Rihanna, and I know I'm moaning, but Jesus Christ, she was awful. Absolutely awful. No, well, not absolutely. She was bad. She's not the greatest of actresses anyway, but it just, and their relationship seemed to they built this great bond because they'd spoken for a few hours, and and so throughout that whole section of the film, which was a sort of maybe the third act or whatever, it really convoluted, random, very strange. You could have easily have been watching different films at each point, and they didn't really seem to tie too much into one another and really have any point of what was going on. All that said, first time I watched Fifth Element, although I enjoyed it, it was a little bit like that. And watching Fifth Element a few more times, I certainly have appreciated that film more. So I do hope that if I watch this film ever again, I will enjoy it a bit more. My fear is I won't, because it just seemed to be kind of nonsense. And a lot of what was going on with the CGI and stuff anyway, some of it's really good, some of it is all right, and there was too much of it. So after all the sort of convoluted nonsense that doesn't seem to really make any bloody sense whatsoever, our two heroes as such eventually come across this race and sort of find out what's happened, and it's basically the human lot have sort of tried to cover up the fact that they destroyed their planet. And the part where their planet got destroyed and why it got destroyed was, again, reasonably interesting. Basically, the humans were fighting another alien race, and there was a big battle going on above this planet. And the humans basically launched a massive sort of assault with some sort of hardcore weaponry, which resulted in the big mothership crashing into this planet and destroying it. And that's kind of interesting concept. I quite like that concept. So that bit was quite good. But then everything that led up to it, again, it was sort of nonsense. We had this point where we need to give these two things to this race, and Valerian has them, and then it will give them the ability to somehow make their planet back again. They made some machine somehow, and they could make their own complete planet come back again, which was weird. And he ends up sort of knocking out the Admiral at one point, which is all very well because he's been a bit of a dickhead, so you can understand it. And then sort of gives them this pearl, but then doesn't give them this other thing because he's he's a soldier first of all, blah blah blah, and he's got duty and stuff like that. I don't understand. You can be talking about duty at 1 second whilst knocking your admiral out 2 seconds beforehand. Those things don't go together. There was all sorts of bits of sort of dialogue and stuff that for me didn't really go together. And to be honest, by the end of the film, I just thought this was complete and utter nonsense. And it's such a shame because I actually was quite looking forward to this film. I heard it didn't get the greatest of ratings, but I still thought I might quite well enjoy it. Watching the scenes randomly, most of them are reasonably entertaining. So the film is entertaining. But none of it makes any fucking sense. It's also just all over the place. And like I say, the two lead actors for me just weren't very good. And putting on a sort of gruffly Batman voice doesn't make you a fucking hero. So yeah, in conclusion, and I've been very negative about this, and like I say, maybe if I watch it again, I might enjoy it a bit more. But I did have my hopes quite high because of the fact that I just think Fifth Element's so well made. All the sort of the imagery and all the sort of stuff and sets and everything that was used in Fifth Element was so good, and that was there in this film, except for they just didn't make any bloody sense. So in the final conclusion, unfortunately, I'm going to give Valerian a 4 out of 10. I was thinking a 3. But to be honest, some of the imagery and stuff is quite good and entertaining. And I did like the whole International Space Station concept and how that grew. And that part of the storyline I did actually really like.